Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game. Woo!
Board game. I got board games.
And today,
Great.
Ben, and
John.
are here to do a review of a very recent trick-taking game called
Cars. The
The
Crew.
Crew. That's a cool picture.
Too bad that's a
What if
video
this
game,
game had
not
that
the actual
picture?
board game.
We are reviewing The Crew, The Quest for Planet 9. That's kind of the subtitle. I guess we should say the full name, but we'll just call it The Crew. Everyone calls it The Crew.
Take Pluto back. Take Pluto back.
So The Crew is published by Cosmos and plays 3 to 5 players. And the box says 20 minutes. I would think time-wise, it's more like maybe 10, 15 minutes. But the game is actually one that you play basically several missions in a row. So then that would be more than 20 minutes. So I don't know where this 20 minutes coming from. I would say 10 to 15 minutes, and then you play it a lot, a lot of times. And so to briefly introduce The Crew, it is a very recent game. It came out either this year, this year, 2020, I believe. I think the German version might have came out earlier, maybe in 2019. But The Crew got a lot of attention because it actually won the Kenner Spiel des Jahres, which is the enthusiast game of the year. And we mentioned in another video before, there is the Spiel des Jahres, which is kind of the main game of the year award. But then the Kenner Spiel was won for kind of basically like gamer game of the year. And this game, I believe, won that one. And so that's a big deal. That means, at least recognized by that committee, it gives the game a lot of attention, and especially for gamers who want kind of more gamery games, this is one to then keep an eye out for. It's not super heavy though. It's still not that kind of award, but it's just kind of more gamer than, say, the Spiel des Jahres, which is more like family weight. And so The Crew is a trick-taking game, which some of you might have an idea about. I think John can maybe explain a little more about trick-taking games.
Yeah, so I think probably the most common or the most famous trick-taking games, known as Hearts. You probably have it on your Windows desktop in some capacity in your Microsoft Games folder or whatever, kind of folder if you grew up with the PCs and stuff. When they had those free games in there, Hearts was one of those games as a trick-taking game.
And so to kind of get into how the game will play, basically I'll go over the most fundamental rules of the game and not all the small rules that will come about later. But I will go over to show a few images of different components from the game and the game setup, and explain how it plays as a trick-taking game. And more than that, actually, something important to mention, it is a cooperative trick-taking game. That's important because Hearts and ones that people might know are competitive trick-taking games. You're just basically trying to win as many tricks as you can, or get as many points as you can through winning tricks.
Or not get points in the case of Hearts. You're trying to get as least points as possible.
But then this is actually a cooperative game. And so here is an image of the components themselves. This is not the game setup, but the components. And the main ones to keep in mind while I'll be explaining the next images are the color cards here, which is basically the main deck for the game. The rocket cards, which are part of that deck. These reminder cards, which are basically placeholders, just to remind you of certain cards you're not holding at a time. These task cards, which are basically small versions of all the color cards, and they'll be used to assign the tasks you want to complete. These tokens up here basically are paired with certain task cards in certain missions, and these radio communication tokens that every player will have one of. And so all of these will kind of come up again while I'm explaining how the game goes. But then here is an image of kind of like what it would be like while you're playing the game and playing a trick, except this player's cards wouldn't be shown. Everyone's just holding their own cards to themselves. But the way a trick taking game works, and I keep mentioning playing a trick, in a trick taking game, a trick is basically what in any other kind of board game, card game, you would call a round, right? One round of the game, where then the first player or leader, or in this case, the player with the commander token for the first round or the first trick, the player with that token will start and they'll play one of the cards from their hand face up into the center. And then the way a trick works is going in order, basically clockwise. Each player will have to follow that card that the leader or commander played. And so if the commander played this pink 9, the next player would have to play a pink card from their hand. And so every player has to follow with a pink card in their hand, unless they don't have a pink card. Then they can play any colored card. But then once each player has played a card, you'll see who actually has the highest number card, who played the highest number card in that same color or that same suit, if you will. And that person will win that trick and basically take all the cards and put them on the side face down. And so that's one trick or one round. And so in a trick taking game, you're usually going to deal out the cards in the beginning of the whole game, deal out all the cards, and then play through all the cards, basically, however many tricks that is. And so in this game, in the Crew, as a cooperative game, the way it changes this up, instead of making it competitive and trying to just win as many tricks as you can, the way it's going to work is, like I mentioned with the other components, there's these task cards, which are dealt out at the beginning of the game also. So you're dealing out all the color cards, which also include rocket cards. You're dealing those out, but then also, depending on the mission you play, you're going to deal out a certain number of task cards among the players. And so the way the Crew is set up is it's cooperative, but also played over missions. And that's what I mentioned in the beginning of playing this game several times in a row, because you can basically just choose a mission to play and then follow that setup or set up whatever goal needs to be done in that mission, play that, and then go on to the next mission, the next challenge, basically. And so the game comes with, you'll see up here, the rule book, which on the back side, upside down, is the log book, which actually tells you the setup for each mission and even gives you some story text. So you're kind of playing through a slight story with it, but it's also mainly just to give you the setup for each mission you're being sent on as a crew. And so the missions obviously will get harder and varied. And the way that happens is, one way is the number of task cards being dealt out. So for example, in this 3-player setup here, you'll see this player has this green 6 and this green 9. And so if that player ended up with those during the setup, and maybe the other players didn't end up with any task cards, what this means is, to fulfill this mission, to win this game this time, this player has to win the tricks with and get the green 9 and the green 6 at some point during this mission. And so once this player wins these 2 cards through whichever tricks, then you fulfilled your mission as a team, and then you can go on to the next mission. But then the difficulty with all of this being cooperative trick taking game is that there is no communication. You cannot tell each other like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll play this green 6 now so you'll win it.
No talking allowed.
No talking aloud. The only point of communication you have is what I mentioned, these green tokens, these radio communication tokens. And the way this works is each player during every game will only have one of these tokens, and the other side is red, basically, after you've used it. And so during a mission, each player has one, but they can only use it once throughout the whole game session, that mission.
for that particular game of tricks that you're playing, right? So it's not if you play a second mission, you get it back, right?
Yeah.
Just to be clear on that side. Yeah, per mission.
And then the way you use it is before any given trick, any given round that you're gonna play cards, any player can decide to use their radio communication token. And if they choose to do that, what it's going to do is it's going to allow them to take one card from their hand. So you don't see the player's hands in this picture, but this player was holding the yellow 9, right? And so he's choosing to use his radio communication token to play his 9 face up in front of him. And that's not playing it for the trick, but it's simply revealing information to the other players. And so they can only do this in one of 3 ways with the radio communication token. They play this yellow 9 face up, and they can put this token either on the top edge of the card, in the middle, or the bottom edge of the card. And those are the only 3 ways they can communicate with their teammates. If this player had put it at the top of the card, he would be telling the rest of his teammates that this yellow 9 is the highest yellow card he has in his hand out of all the yellow cards he could have. If you put it on the bottom, it would mean it's the lowest yellow card he has in his hand. And if he puts it in the middle, it means that's the only yellow card he has in his hand. And so all of this is valuable information. You can't just tell each other. You can only play your token to tell each other in one of these 3 ways. And you can only do it once per trick, like I said. And so once you play this, that's when you also take one of these kind of like moon looking cards. Like I mentioned, those are the reminder cards. And this player would put it in their hand, basically to remind them that this yellow 9 face up in front of them is technically still in their hand, part of their hand, still needs to be played at some point with a trick. And so this is a game where you have that limited communication, but then also trying to fulfill the task of either winning the specific cards that are shown with the task cards, but also other variations with these other tokens I mentioned. You could see that there are tokens that have these arrows or these numbers. And in this case, the way this game is progressing, this green 9 task has this 1 on it. And so what that means is that this player not only has to win the green 9, they actually have to do that first. I believe in the first trick.
Is it the first trick or is it the first trick they win? I believe it's the first trick they win must be that.
Let me just make sure.
Maybe. I might be wrong. Could be wrong. That could be the arrows one. I could be mistaken with the arrows.
It says the task must be fulfilled first.
Okay.
Yeah. So what that means, is this player would have to win this as the first task.
Yeah. So a trick could be won as long as no other tasks are won, right? So if the other players, let's say like, if you can see the other players in this board have the 1 in the 6 and then the 1 in the 6 blue and the 4 blue and the yellow 6. If any of those tricks or the green 6, if any of those are completed before the 9 is completed, the 9 green, then the whole team loses.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what it means.
Yeah. So as the first task that is completed, this has to be the first one. And then over here, this blue 6 has to be the second one that's done. And then the way the arrows work, depending on the mission, if they're included in the mission, is if they're assigned to task cards, that would mean the thing with the task with the single arrow has to be completed sometime before the task with the second arrow, double arrow, is completed. And so that kind of gives a rough order, where then these numbers actually seem more like a concrete order. And so that's the way the game makes the tasks harder, by kind of imposing this order on them and increasing the number of tasks that need to be done, all the while following the same trick-taking rules, playing with the whole deck of cards, and having this radio communication as the only way to communicate. And then the last thing to mention was there were rocket cards that I mentioned in my other picture. These rocket cards, there's 1 through 4 of these, where the color cards have 1 through 9. But these 1 through 4 rockets are also shuffled with the the color cards when they're dealt out in the beginning. And how this works is it's basically its own suit, which is a trump suit. And so they'll always win the trick that they're played in. And but then the rule is that they can only be played by a player if they don't have a color to follow whatever color the commander or first player that trick started the trick with. So in the example here, right, if there were 4 players here, right, and the one player started the trick with green, the other 2 followed, but then the 4th one doesn't have green, then if they have a rocket, they could play it. And even though it's not green, they would actually win the trick. And so that's what it means to have a trump card in a trick-taking game. It basically always wins the trick, and unless other rockets are also played in that same trick, in that case, you would compare which has a higher number, and that player is the one that won the trick. And so that is basically how you'll play through all of the crew in this cooperative, trick-taking, mission-based way. So the crew, John.
Yeah, so there was a lot that we talked about in there. So if you're familiar with trick-taking games, the concept of playing should be, I mean, it's pretty much a trick-taking game. There's not really a lot of deviation in terms of like subverting how to play a trick-taking, except what we were talking about with the rocket ships, which is a pretty significant change. So in most trick-taking games, if you've played them in the past, they typically don't have trump cards. It's not a common thing for trick-taking games to have. So in this game, it is a pretty unique mechanic to have, which is cool because as we were kind of saying, normally in these styles of games, if you're off suit, you'll never win a trick. You're always off suit, which means you'll never be able to win those tricks. So in certain types of competitive ones, that's a good thing. But in this game, it's also really unique because kind of moving a bit away from that is this game takes trick taking to a very different level. So as also mentioned, it's usually a very competitive type of game, right? Trick taking games is usually about trying to either win as few tricks as possible or win as many as possible, depending on kind of the style. Or if you've probably heard of the phrase shooting the moon in these games, it's usually when you're trying to get all of the tricks that are relevant or important, whether it's dependent on certain suits or it's dependent on winning certain types of cards within the style or the type of game that you're playing. That's kind of like usually you're trying to force other people out of the game is how you're playing trick takings. But in this game, as we showed, it's not about winning tricks even per se. It's about making sure that your teammates are getting the tasks done correctly, which is a very different way of seeing how to run trick taking games. So you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, those 2 things of the trump card, which is kind of a more of a modern addition to trick taking games, I would say, and then the cooperative aspect, which is very modern addition. Like I think those are the 2 things I do like a lot about the crew. Those are definitely the co-op, because I like co-op games, and so that makes it stand out to me a lot. That especially since with trick taking games, I feel like the traditional way it's done without trump cards either and just competitive, it can feel like you just get really stuck with your hand. You know, like if the other players have basically all the high cards and you just have all low cards, you're probably gonna lose. You know, like it's stacked against you, and that's just by chance.
Unless that's what you're trying to go for.
But then to add a trump, right, it gives some way of getting around it, right? And so that's like, okay, cool. There's a little, in a sense, balancing added to it, which is smart. But then once you have that balance, then it's like, oh, but then it's cooperative. It's not even competitive. So it's like, okay, so it's more of like a complexity to the game that, in a way, as a cooperative game, then makes it harder, right? If as a competitive game, a trump card would make it more balanced and in a sense like fair and easier. Like I feel like the opposite would happen once you made it cooperative. It made it more complex because you're stuck with these powerful cards that could really throw off how you're planning things.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that's really important to understand about this as a trick-taking game is, again, the subversion of this expectations of what you want to do in a trick taking game. So as we were saying, a lot of the time is collection of cards, which is still the same objective in the crew, but it's an objective that's based on single cards, single particular cards that you have to complete, which is not the way that most trick taking games go. Most of the trick taking games, typically when you play them, is usually point collection in some capacity, or suit collection, so that you can get the most points or the least points depending on it. But in this game, it's like certain players have to get certain cards. And so when Ben was talking about the complexity of it, that's kind of where the trump card comes in, where it's like, okay, it's good to have trump cards sometimes, because basically what ends up happening in this game as we played it, and kind of what becomes a lot of the strategy in this game, is this balancing act of, when is it my turn to be the lead and trying to win or gain cards, versus when is it my turn, when is it my role to try to get other people to win the cards from me, for example. So as we showed in the cards, you're dealing out all of the cards that are sitting in the deck, and everybody has their different tasks that they have to complete. So somebody has the card, and the person who has the card may not be the player who needs to win it, because, you know, even if you're holding it in your hand, doesn't mean that you have it until you win a trick that gives it to you. So that's also kind of this weird part of the game, which again, in normal trick taking, you usually don't have such a specific expectation, right? In this kind of way, or changing expectation, right?
Yeah, I think those two being like the biggest, I would say, biggest changes to the trick taking mechanism, right? Mechanic in the game, are kind of the pros that make it work well. But then I think what pushes it even like another level is the no communication, right?
Yep.
Like once it introduced that, I mean, even just explaining those first two together, it's like, okay, it'll throw me a bit because maybe I'm not familiar with trick taking, or I'm not sure how it'll work as a co-op game. But then now you're saying we can't even talk to each other. And but then it's obviously not just no talking, right? It's this particular limited way of communicating, which then is smart too, right? Because if it was just no talking, I think it might feel kind of boring, right? Like you're just seriously just guessing at how to win each task, right? How to fulfill each task. But then to have this kind of limited communication that's also very restricted, like it's very clear exactly what you can communicate. And so not only then does it come down to figuring out what you should be communicating to your teammates, like maybe like, yeah, you see that like John's task is to win this card I have. So then like, should I show that I have it, or maybe show that it's the only blue card I have? So you want to be careful about playing tricks that will make me play it. But then even on top of that, you need to figure out when you're going to tell your teammates, because as you're playing the tricks, your hand is changing, right? Like I might have like 4 blue cards and have the card that John wants, and it's like, okay, do I tell him now? So then you think like, okay, how would I actually do it with this communication token? Or do I wait to play some tricks till maybe that's the only blue card I have? Then it's, in a sense, in that way, easier to communicate in some way, or more clearly. But then, yeah, there is that kind of timing with when you're going to communicate also, which I think is really smart.
And as you were kind of saying before, if the game had no communication or no way of kind of interacting with each other and giving information, the game probably would not work. Like, in all honesty, this game would not work at all, right? With the number of tasks and the way that the tasks operate, it just would not be a functional game, right? In all honesty, there does need to be some sense of working together. So like in competitive games, obviously, yeah, you're not going to be sharing with people what you have because you don't want them to know. Like, you're supposed to be operating with secrecy of your information. And what people try to do is count what you might have, because the cards are always the same, right? You always have the same amount of cards and the numbers in the game. But in this game, you're like, no. We need to help each other because that's how we get the job done, right? But, you know, as we were saying, it would be way too easy of a game if you got to just say what you had and stuff. So I think the other clever thing about the restriction on the command tokens, as Ben was mentioning, is like, when you give the clue, it has to be accurate. as well. That's the other thing that's really important. Like if you have multiple blue cards, as we were mentioning, let's say you have the blue 5 that someone else needs to have, and you kind of want to give them a signal. If that card's not the only blue that you have, it's not the highest blue that you have, nor is it the lowest blue that you have, you cannot give information about the fact, you can't use that card and play it out. You have to do at least a few tricks to make it satisfy one of those requirements. So even if there is something that you really like, you're like, okay, I know what he has, or like, I know he needs to win this, and I want to help him win it, but I have other players I have to keep in mind, because that's the other thing. It's like, let's say that player plays like a somewhat high blue card, like let's say a 6 or a 7, and then I'm like, okay, maybe I could play the blue 5 now, but another player after you could play a higher blue, or they ran out of blue cards and they play the rocket ship and they take it, and then you all lose because you didn't get the card, right? So there's this, as Ben was saying, it's the timing of when you need to give that clue as well. And it plays out a lot in the game, because now it's not just a matter of, oh, it's just easy for me to tell someone I have that card already for them. It's like, oh, I got to do more than that. And the fact that, as we were saying, once you get to the higher levels, you start having like 3 or 4 tasks, which means every player is going to have that many tasks. And you only have 1 command token. So you can't tell everybody that you have 4 different cards. Like you can only do 1 card. So
yeah, and I think the last 2 pros I have to say for this game, maybe 3, two together are, and this is kind of a given with how we've been talking about the game, is that the game is played over missions. And I think that's really impressive that the game has 50 missions for you. And it's basically to increase in difficulty and has a little storyline with it. I think that's just a nice way of going about it. Trying to add theme to it, which I appreciate, even though I didn't really pay attention to any of the theme when we were playing it. But you know, they do that, right? They actually, and this is like kind of the second thing I wanted to say linked with that, is like I mentioned, there's the rule book, and then the back side upside down is the log book. And this, when you start flipping through it this way, is when you get all the setups for each mission that you go on. Right, so mission 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it tells you how to set it up with the little story text. And why this is a pro for me, not just repeating what I said, but they also have your logbook set up so you could write down, oops, over here, your crew that you actually did these missions with. And I think the way it's set up is like you can have 6 different crews, and you're basically writing their name here and then writing like how long it took to accomplish all your missions, and that's what all these like check boxes are for, indicating like that first crew that you wrote down finished it. And so I think that's just a, like, again, part of that way of adding theme, making it kind of more personal, right? That, oh yeah, like I can record how well we actually did together with these group of friends going through this number of missions. And so I think that's, yeah, it's nice. It's a small pros, but this kind of mission system that they also made into a slight story campaign system, it's kind of surprising to do with such a small game. And the last pro, if John's not gonna mention anything else, is just that it's a small game. Like I think this is great. Like this actually is partly what appealed to me when I first heard about it, of like, oh, like this game won Gamer Game of the Year, just this small game, and it's a trick-taking co-op game. Okay, sure, easy to get and try because it's so small. Could it be smaller and more easy to carry around? Possibly. I can see it because like half of it is like a tray for cards, and then there's a whole slot for like tokens. But this is still a small game, and so to produce it that way, that's just another small pro. And so moving on,
small pro, small box, small pro.
And so moving on to the cons, what we didn't like about the game.
I don't want to take yours, so
really?
Yeah,
Do you actually share the
I'm
thought?
not gonna take yours. It's, what would I say? I think, okay, I'll take this one. So I'm going to steal one that Ben usually will talk about. I will say that thematically, this game it's a trick taking game, in all honesty, like in the end of it, right? Trick taking games being trick taking games, like you could totally remove this theme from this game entirely and it would play just fine. Like it doesn't need to be in space. It doesn't need to have this logbook. It doesn't need to have any of that stuff. And it still plays fine as it is. So it's not a knock about the mechanics of the game, but it's more the fact that the theme doesn't really do anything for the game in that sense. So it's a small dock against it, but it's just like, it's kind of a heady game in the sense of like, it's really just, playing through it. So even as Ben was saying, like when we played through the game, I think the space theme wasn't really important. It didn't really speak to me of like, I feel like I'm on a mission, like going through space, doing things to fix up, like getting my way from point A to point B to point C to get to the planet 9, right? Like that, like it didn't feel that. Maybe if we read the logbook more or like read through the story a little bit more, it'd give us more of that. But even reading through it, it's kind of like, again, it's nice that they tried, but it really doesn't add, like the theme doesn't add anything to this game at all. Again, if they literally released it as just a bunch of tokens with the cards that just had the colors on them and then just trump cards with whatever artwork, it didn't even have to be rocket, it could be anything, and like the game itself would play fine, right? And it would play exactly the same mechanically and you wouldn't lose anything, which is why it's kind of a dock in that way. It's just like, oh, it's another trick taking game. But again, not that it's a bad trick taking game. It's just thematically, it's like Hearts. Hearts doesn't need a theme to be played. You literally play it with any 52 card deck, right?
Well, that's pretty close to my main con. I know you're trying to avoid it, but you
it's hard to
got it. I mean, John knows my main con is that it's trick taking, which then kind of saying in the reverse way what John said, I'm not into trick taking games because they are usually not thematic.
Yeah.
You came at it from the theme angle, but I'm just coming at the same thing from the mechanics angle. Where, I mean, I don't have that many trick-taking games. There is one other one that I did find pretty interesting, I think partly because of the production of it and kind of the theme, called Indulgence by Restoration Games, which maybe we will review in the future. But yeah, in general, I mean, I don't think I ever played Hearts growing up, and so never got into that. And yeah, and even though like trick-taking works well in the game, it still just feels like a mechanism at times because it's not thematic, and it just seems almost impossible to make that mechanic thematic. Maybe, I mean, I think I've heard of it in like a magician game where you're doing tricks. There you go, a theme that works. But otherwise, yeah, it just seems really hard to make it thematic and thus engaging in that way. And so what really has to engage you is the puzzle of the cooperative trick taking, which from our pros, you might get the sense that it did it pretty well. But again, it's still just, you have to like trick taking because that is the main mechanic, and none of the token production attempt at theme really is as big as the fact that it's a trick-taking game. So
popping back to pros slightly, because I realized I didn't say anything about this, but I think another really strong aspect of the game is that whole puzzle aspect. And I know Ben was talking about the scenarios and that there's a lot of missions, but I also think I think that really is one of the biggest strengths of this game, is the fact that it gives you a lot of challenges as a cooperative game for trick-taking things, where the scaling of the difficulty over time as you play the game and the kinds of puzzles effectively that you need to solve and work through do scale and get harder and harder, and it becomes more and more interesting in the ways that you need to manipulate the cards, the way that you need to manipulate working with other players and figuring out how to work your hand to ensure that the missions end up successful, right? So I don't know if we kind of really maybe we've hit this point a few times, but I really wanted to kind of push that as like that really is the big sell about this,
No,
right?
no,
And Ben kind of said it too.
like
But
when you were talking about your con, that's actually what came to mind too. Is like, oh, I didn't say this during the pros also,
Yep.
which just straight out, the puzzle of this trick taking co-op game is engaging. Like you play, like I mentioned, you'll play probably several missions in a row because you just like get the first one done. You're like, okay, I get it. Like it wasn't hard, but now I understand, and it's gonna maybe just increasing difficulty in a similar way. So we'll see if we can do those. And you get to the next one, and you're like, okay. And then maybe at some point, I know I've done this, like I've acted too hastily, where it's like, oh, this is easy, and then I just like immediately play a card, and then the teammate's like, dude, you just messed it up. And it's like, oh yeah,
that's right, Ben.
Other people have. And so then there's just those different layers of the puzzle, which then make it an engaging puzzle, even without the theme. It is an engaging puzzle. So yes, revisiting with that pro.
yeah, we had to go back because I was like, oh, we got to say that.
So I mean, we talked about a lot of pros, just a couple cons, and went back to pros. So this probably says some good things about the game and what we think of it.
0.5 rating.
So we will move on to our ratings, and John guesses the way. So John, your score for the game. You already know mine because I was kind of asking you about it before.
I know, and you're gonna feel like I cheated. So do you want to say yours first? No.
Yeah, what's your score, John?
So I will say I give the crew, my rating is a 7.5. I think it's a very solid trick-taking game. I think that it takes it in a way that is different than a lot of the trick-taking games. It's cooperative, which is also a bonus. I do enjoy cooperative games as well, despite my competitive nature. But I also think just the way that they were able to bring in trick-taking with the cooperative elements, with the communication elements, I think all three of those kind of, and the tasks, right? Those things combined together makes it a very solid game that I'm more than willing to want to keep trying and playing over and over again at this point. Like we're only on like mission 12 or 13, I think. So there's still another 37 missions that we need to complete. So I look forward to it. I've always enjoyed trick-taking games in general. I like the appeal of like the puzzle solving, and there is a lot of card counting that actually does happen in these kinds of games. I like that kind of style of playing a game, but then the fact that you get to do it with other players now, right? You're actually working together versus I'm card counting because I'm going to destroy you because I know what cards you have because I counted it out correctly or I guessed it, right? So that is my rating, 7.5. Weight, 2.13.
2.13. Okay. And so John is guessing 2.13 to win a copy of The Crew. Kenner Spiel your winner. Me, before I actually show my score, I'll actually give all my reasons first for my score. I actually do have a really high opinion of this game, even though it is what I consider a lighter game. And so for those of you who have been, watching other reviews, I probably heard me say like for these kind of filler or lighter games, I think the highest I would ever give is 7.5. Maybe I don't think ever an 8. I think that 8 is kind of reserved for bigger, immersive experience kind of games. But again, 7.5 is not bad. I think according to BGG, right, John, 7.5 is between usually willing to play and like good and would suggest
willing to play,
basically.
Kind of,
And so it's between there. But I do have a positive opinion of the game because of the puzzle, as John mentioned. Even though my con was that it kind of feels like just a trick-taking game and that mechanic, I think in the case of games that don't have theme, even though I care a lot about theme, if they don't have theme, they have to be a very good puzzle, basically, right? Because basically board games are puzzles in some way, put together with all different kinds of mechanics and ways of getting at it, but stripped down, still some kind of puzzle. And so if there's no theme that engages you, it has to be a very engaging puzzle, which I think it is. But then also, along with that, I think, is the cooperative aspect, because I like co-op games. And then actually something that does stick to me quite a bit too is the way it does the limited communication, because I do admire when games or designers design their game with some kind of limitation and restriction, but are very clear about it. And I think that's, in a sense, more just part of good design, right? Like you could have a great idea of like, oh yeah, like the you're playing cooperative game, but you have limited communication. It's like, okay, what does that mean? I don't know. You just can't communicate the way you normally do, you know, or like, you know, something really wishy-washy. Like you can say these kind of words, but not these kind of words, you know. But like when they can implement like a small mechanic like that, this restriction, but do it clearly so that players can play and know how to play, that's good design. And so, and I definitely think they do that with the communication token mechanic here. Just, it's very clear. And so you don't have issues with how you can go about it, but you also know it's part of the puzzle and makes it difficult. And so with all that said, the score I give The Crew is
Drum roll.
7.5.
Oh, so close.
John, and the weight is a 2, not
Solid
a
2.
2.13. And actually, I just learned recently, I think we actually can, whoops, didn't mean to click it, but I think the community actually votes on the score. So
why I'm
if
never
you had an
gonna get
account, you could skew the score yourself, the weight itself. Like I think if I click here, yeah, it'll ask me what I think it is. So after all these years, now I know the weight is determined by the community, I think.
So I should just go into it and start just. Oh, I just go into there before we start this video.
But yeah, so 7.5 from John, 7.5 from me, which for me means it's basically the top tier of these light games. These light, you could say family weight. I wouldn't say this is exactly a filler game, but it is still kind of on the light side, clearly with the 2. An average from the community though, an 8, which is actually very good, very solid opinion of the game. Well, yes, that is our review of The Crew, Kenner Spiel des Jahres winner, and actually a bunch of other things too that you can see here, awards and honors. I think a lot of German awards, nominations and wins. A lot of Golden Geek nominee. Oh, it did win Best Co-op Game. Wow, okay, for 2019. But yes, so that is The Crew. If you guys found this interesting, helpful, please like this video, share this video, perhaps subscribe so you'll
he
hear
said
more
it
videos.
finally.
Finally happening. I'm asking for people to subscribe if you want to hear more of these kind of reviews and these kind of videos, unboxings, previews, and as usual, also just share this video with friends, family, people you play board games with. I hope you get to check out this game, The Crew. 7.5 from both me and John, so very good game. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Goodbye.